The Plus Universal IEM is an earphone designed in-house by Massdrop, a company that is more well known for selling products rather than making the product. Surely there have been countless electronics sold with the Massdrop name slapped on top, but this one is unlike any other. This is the first IEM designed from the ground up by Massdrop, from the shape of the earpiece, selection of each individual components to sound tuning. There's a detailed explanation of the rationale behind the tuning at different frequencies, and their goal is to recreate the technicalities of professional audio monitors while mixing in some tasteful bass boost to arrive at a happy medium between reference sound and fun sound. And to top it all off, this earphone is assembled and QC'd in the USA. You would think the very first product from this company would fail pretty hard in the competitive world of audio gear, but seeing the majority of customers actually giving it a 5-star rating on the product page, some even with sensational claims like best sounding IEMs you can get below $500 together with generally high praises from IEM forums. Look, this guy even says, "It's the best thing you can get under $1,000. The skepticism in me just can't help but wonder if Massdrop was actually able to get so much right with their first earphone. Did Massdrop have a stroke of genius?
You're a goddamn genius!
Or did the people who liked it just had a stroke? I mean, no offense, but like, audiophiles tend to type up basically anything and everything, so you've got to be critical, and critical I am. And with that said, this is Earphoneus Fanaticus. Today I'll be reviewing this earphone as a whole package, from physical design, accessories, sound quality to ear-tip compatibility, in order to determine whether this earphone is worth $300. There'll be timestamps in the video description so that you can jump to parts you are most interested in. And if you just want my final verdict, there will also be another timestamp. Please enjoy the review, and if you are also interested in my unboxing of this earphone, you can check the link in the description down below as well. Now, like I said just now, this earphone cost $300, but my order actually came up to be a little bit more than $330 because I also purchased the balance cable to go along with the earphone, which I'll also discuss later on. Firstly, let's check out the Massdrop Plus. It is a universal IEM with 3D printed shells that looks like a custom pair. I tend to call this kind of earphone demo earphones, because they are just like those demos you try out when choosing an earphone model to make customs with. They are the closest thing to an actual custom IEM, and as such, you should expect nothing but pure comfort and mostly fantastic fit from these earphones. But what about the Massdrop Plus? I would say the fit is pretty much perfect for me, a bit too perfect even because the nozzle extends too deeply into my ear canal, so finding a pair of comfortable ear tips for them is quite a daunting process, but it isn't impossible. In terms of isolation, I think this is one of the best, if not the best performer in my collection. It's crazy how much noise it is able to cut out, even on public transport. It honestly feels a bit dangerous walking around with them. On both earpieces, there is a square slot where the 2-pin connector would go. On close inspection, it looks a bit dirty, and there's this red stuff at the corner. At first, I thought there was some dirt there, but I tried to use a pen to poke at it and it just wouldn't budge. It is probably some kind of red paint that for whatever reason was left behind during assembly. Looks a little bit sloppy to be honest. Removing the ear tip reveals an interesting set of balls, a pinhole plus a crescent hole. And looking at the internals, I think the pinhole is connected to the two Sony BAs for lower frequencies, while the crescent hole is dedicated to a singular Sony BA that handles both mids and highs. In total, there are 3 BAs in each earpiece in a 2-way crossover setup. In terms of technical specs, frequency response is rated from 5Hz to 18 kHz. Because it doesn't reach 40 kHz, the Plus is not high-res certified, but nobody cares. The Plus is very picky when it comes to source, and it is immediately apparent when looking at impedance and sensitivity rating. Impedance is rated at an extremely low 10 ohms, meaning it will perform optimally only when the output impedance of the source is less than 1.25 ohms. Most likely, your common smartphones or even some expensive DAPs in the market can't even reach this low. If you try to pair this earphone with a high output impedance, certain frequency ranges will be boosted or lowered by a few decibels, effectively changing how the drivers inside the earphone is supposed to sound. Of course, some people will take advantage of this and try to get it to sound a certain way, but that's not something I shoot for. I want it to sound like how it is engineered to be, and to that end, the lowest output impedance is required. Sensitivity is rated at 109 dB per milliwatt, so it won't hesitate to tell you, hey, your audio source is hissing. It isn't as high compared to other earphones I own, but then again a lot of them are not rated with the same low impedance. With the sensitivity and impedance in mind, you can expect the Plus to be noticeably louder than other earphones no matter what source you feed it with. But for the most optimal performance, you need a really good source that has near zero impedance, as well as no hissing noises. This is really weird because I don't think this earphone is really targeted towards those with that kind of gear. And chances are, if you can afford that, your budget will be way beyond the Plus anyway. That is to say, the Plus needs the best source out there, but itself is not necessarily a top-of-the-line earphone that deserves it. Next, let's look at the accessories. Why don't we start with the cable first? This cable uses 2-pin connector, which is exactly what the Plus uses. The ear guide is basically plastic, heat molded into a certain curvature. I think the curvature is a bit much, and there isn't much you can do in terms of customizing the fit of the cable. A quality control issue I noticed regarding the ear guide is that on my 3.5mm cable, the right ear guide is cut longer than the left one. Not only that, from this shot you can see the right ear guide is curved way more than the other one. Finally, on this and the balance cable, the ear guide is not molded to the same standard. From this shot, you can tell both sides are leaning towards the right. This reeks of poor craftsmanship and makes me doubt Massdrop's sincerity in delivering a quality product. Absolutely laughable. I like how Massdrop even boasted about the assembly and QC being done in the USA. Now I don't know much about Made in USA, but if this is what Made in USA means, man, I've got to say I'm seriously impressed, like wow. In all seriousness though, hopefully it is all just a crude joke and maybe this cable is actually made in China. That will explain a lot too. But my biggest complaint comes from the sleeving material they used. Let me just get this clear. This is the stiffest knitted cable I've ever used. And that's saying a lot because up until this point, I knew no such thing as a stiff knitted cable. But here we are. I can try to make a loop out of it, but sometimes it will just bounce back like a koi out of the water. And when I actually use it on the go, it flops around against my body, and I hear this as some of the worst cable noise I ever experienced out of a cable of such a thin diameter. Another complaint I have is the choker. My god, this thing just wouldn't budge at all. I mean, look at this. How hard is it to make a tiny piece of plastic with 2 holes that are large enough for 2 strands of cables? Did Massdrop even try using the damn thing before selling it? The rest is equally unimpressive. It doesn't terminate with a right angle jack, and the metallic looking bit feels more like cheap plastic. I also just want to mention that this cable for whatever reason doesn't play nice with the Plus, because quite often I would slowly but surely lose sounds on the right channel when listening, which can't be fixed by refitting the cable, but then when I use it with another earphone it works completely fine. Overall, I think purchasing this cable is a bad play, and for $30 US, there are better investments out there. I don't regret buying it though, because I get to tell the rest of the world how shit this thing really is. Like seriously, don't buy it. The earphone comes with 1 set of single flange silicone tips, 1 set of double flange silicone tips, and 1 set of foam tips, all in small, medium, and large. The single flange is generic, and while the double flange is cool in theory, it feels and sounds like the single flange tip except for maybe less high treble. One problem for me is that at medium size, the lower flange of this tip is not wide enough to seal up my ear canal, but then when I switch to the large size, the upper flange becomes too wide and irritates my ears. Overall, I don't understand the point of including this set of ear tips, especially when it's so similar to the single flange ones outside of comfort reasons. To me, it's not even that comfortable. As for the foam tips, they are supple and very sticky when new for some reason. I'm very iffy about using this tip because firstly, just like all the other stock tips, it doesn't actually fit the Plus's huge sound tube. Normally with the other tips, I can just force it on, but if I do the same with these, I'm very certain they won't last long. In fact, when I was A/Bing between this and the single flange tips, I noticed the foam and the tube are already slightly falling apart. This can be easily resolved had Massdrop actually tried the fitting on their own product. Besides that, at small size it already looks just as big as the medium-sized silicone tips. Finally, if you try using it like the usual memory foam tips, you will notice how quickly it rebounces. This usually happens only to compliant tips that have been used for 1 to 2 weeks, but this is a new pair and it already behaves like this. Once again, Massdrop didn't put enough thoughts into this. However, while it fails miserably in terms of practical use, I do think it sounds the best out of all the stock tips because it just makes the sound more concrete and well defined without drawbacks in sound signature. Hopefully Massdrop will be able to improve on these foam tips when they do come up with a new set of earphones. The rest of the accessories includes a cleaning tool, a 3.5mm cable that looks exactly like the balance cable, and this hard shell carrying case. Like I've said in the unboxing, it looks a bit cheap because the plastic has a slight smoky look to it, but it is very solid and the locking mechanism has a nice click to it. The internal is slightly padded with 2 pieces of foam, not much to talk about here. One very cool thing about the case is that it is actually waterproof. I've tried running water around the gap, the locking mechanism, the hinge, and when I opened it, it was completely dry inside. Overall, this carrying case is more practical than flashy, and I can respect that. So far, looking at the whole package, I just can't help but feel there's a sense of unpolishedness, if that's even a word. Whether I'm looking at the 2-pin slot on the earpiece, the stickiness of the foam tips, the smoky, slightly dirty looking carrying case, the cable, my god, the cable, and not surprisingly, the packaging itself. Everything just came in this flimsy little box with a clear lack of effort in artistic design, and the interior is just mostly empty space. A stark contrast to earphones from other manufacturers in this price range. For a lower price, you can buy Chi-Fi earphones with way better packaging that is more satisfying to open up. The cost cut is clear everywhere, so why do these still cost $300 US? These had better sounded real good to justify the asking price, not to mention there are a lot of competitions out there around the same price range, including the hard to find new Sony MDR EX1000 and the OnQ E900M, 2 earphones I've reviewed in the past with high praises. So how does the Massdrop Plus stack up? In the following section, I'll analyze the sound signature and the technical capabilities of this earphone. These impressions are done with my OnQ DP-X1A as my audio source with ACG mode turned off, lock range adjust at +2, and digital filter set to high. For tests, like dynamic range and bass rattling, I use a Chord Mojo paired to my PC's digital output. The earphone itself is fitted with the single flange tips in medium that came with this earphone. Since I purchased this with the 2.5mm cable, I'll be presenting all my impressions by using the balance outputs from my DAP for the most optimal performance. Starting from the bass, which is handled by 2 vendor drivers, I'm only able to hear the bass starting from 20Hz, despite the quoted 5Hz by Massdrop. I've repeated this many times, and I'm 100% sure I can hear at the very least 10Hz with other earphones, but not this one. There's nothing down there until 20Hz, at which the sub-bass shows up and increases steadily in volume until 100Hz. After which the volume is basically even up until 200Hz. Now this doesn't mean the earphone is tuned to have a bass roll-off per se. In fact, this probably means it is tuned to output a mostly even bass from 20Hz to 200Hz. But when you consider things like ear resonance, lack of body conduction of sounds, and the human ear's actual sensitivity to different frequencies, it translates into a weak sub-bass performance. It lacks punch, and is mostly weak in an actual listening scenario. It also lacks dynamics and doesn't add much to the music. It doesn't matter you're a bass head or not, it is just mediocre, and typical of bass generated by balanced armature drivers. If you've heard the Logitech UE900 or UE900S, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. This is quite a stark contrast compared to the product's description of extended bass. And let me just quote this from the product page. This produces a rumble and movement of air when the bass is called for, and may even cause the Plus to sound like a hybrid IEM, though all drivers are balanced armature. This cannot be further away from truth, you lied to me, Massdrop. A positive point regarding the Plus though is that I heard no rattling in this range, which either means the drivers are of good quality, or it is mounted properly inside the earpiece. Overall, I would say the bass on this is quite eh. The year is now 2019, but I feel like I've traveled back in time to 2013 when I first heard the UE900. I liked it back then, but I demand more now. Moving on to the mids, this is where vocals and melodic line are mostly located in. I'm generally not that picky in this range because the manufacturers don't do anything too crazy here most of the time. However, I will say the Plus is not particularly splendid here. The melodic line tends to have this kind of muddy quality that decreases the airiness. It's by no means suffocating, but it's almost like how a person would sound speaking through 3 layers of face masks. The reason for this is probably due to how the lower mids are tuned. If this graph posted by Massdrop is reliable, we can easily identify the 200 to 1000 Hz region being the culprit here. Ideally, you want 200 Hz to be lower than 1000 Hz, which is the complete opposite in the case of this earphone. The reason why they tuned it like this is probably because they wanted to boost the bass, while making it seamlessly transition to the lower mids, except this also means the lower mids are boosted as well, which can definitely explain the muddy horn sound I described before. The tuning here reminds me of the Dundu DK3001, which I've praised before for its rich male vocals and lower mids, except comparing to that, male vocals lean towards the thinner side on the plus, so they don't sound as masculine, like the DK3001 or the AKG K3003, and cello music is not particularly rich and reverberant either. Some other major problems plague the overall presentation and clarity, which I'll get to later on. Moving on to female vocals, I don't have any major complaints other than sometimes it could get slightly muffled during busy passages in the music. Not exactly in the sense of driver tuning and frequency response, but rather the earphone is unable to resolve so much information blasting at the same time. Overall, I would say the mids are lacking in clarity and airiness, so it is largely unimpressive. Finally, for the treble, it seems Massdrop has gone with a safer approach, which is to create high frequencies that are non-fatiguing to the ears even for long listening sessions. This earphone is by no means dark sounding, but there are a few specific points I want to touch on later. In terms of frequency response, the upper limit I'm able to achieve with this earphone is only 16 kHz. Anything above is basically inaudible to me even in an isolated room without aircon, doors and windows both shut. There's just nothing up there, and once again, this deviates from Massdrop's official rating of 18 kHz max. Not that I think there are anything musically meaningful at such mosquito-like frequencies, so I don't really care. When doing frequency sweeps with my ears, I think there is a very sharp peak around 8 to 9 kHz, and a much gentler peak between 14 to 15 kHz. Outside of listening to test tones and frequency sweeps, I find the treble on the Massdrop Plus to be lacking in shimmer and sparkle. This is most apparent when I try band sounds, especially heavy metal. When comparing to something like the AKG N5005, it almost sounds like some drums are either gone or reduced to nothing but a faint echo. The resolving power here is so bad that sometimes you can't even tell what you're hearing. The weak treble performance doesn't just affect high-pitched sounds, but also the overall articulation and airiness of music, with many layers of musical elements firing at the same time. If you want the earphone to sound clean and clear from top to bottom, you need some high frequencies tastefully boosted to a sufficient level, like maybe a 5 to 10 dB increase at 10 kHz so it matches 1 kHz, and unfortunately for this earphone, Massdrop just didn't do it enough. The old EX1000 and the cheaper Onkyo E900M treat this range differently, but their presentations are both miles ahead of this earphone. Speaking of clarity and resolving power, when I was specifically examining the treble quality, I noticed the Plus's Transient Response is a touch behind all the earphones in my collection. And this is once again more noticeable when listening to heavy metal. I have to say this is not something I expect out of BA drivers, so maybe there's something else going on. But there's always a very slight smearing, which might also contribute to the low clarity. I'm not sure if this is because there's only one driver handling both the mids and highs, or maybe the Sony drivers are just not as good as the nose counterparts. But one thing I can say for certain is that I am not a fan of this earphone's performance in treble. Now let's see if the Plus is able to gain any points back when it comes to soundstage and layering. Starting from horizontal soundstage, I think the width is actually quite wide, but not as wide as the good old EX1000. Nothing to be ashamed of, I suppose. Horizontal layering is decent too, so it's actually not difficult for me to tell the general directions sounds are coming from. But once again, because of problematic tuning in treble and slightly below average transients, articulation suffers, which lowers my ability to see the shape and texture of sounds, so to speak. Rather than being focused at single points of sounds, they tend to image like a smear in my mind. But something that truly impresses me would be this earphone's vertical soundstage. Thanks to its custom IEM-like form factor, The Soundstage actually has height to it, which feels like a breath of fresh air compared to so many small form factor earphones out there. If there isn't enough space inside the earpiece, there isn't much tweaking you can do in terms of driver positioning. They don't have to just fire horizontally to the ear canal, but also possibly above or below it, and being a bigger than average earphone does give the Massdrop Plus a huge edge. Unfortunately, despite the tall soundstage, there is still very little to no vertical layering, so I can't get this illusion of sounds coming from above and below. Still, I think just on vertical soundstage alone, the Massdrop Plus already has many earphones beat. Not too shabby. One final aspect I want to quickly go through is dynamic range. With this earphone, I'm able to reach 66 decibels in a quiet room, which is pretty much the norm in my collection of earphones. Generally, you want the dynamic range to be as wide as possible, so that you can easily hear both the loudest sounds and the softest sounds in a piece of music with ease. But as I've repeated time and again, this number is obtained by my own listening, and it will be heavily affected by things like surrounding environment, isolation, or any hearing damage you have accumulated over the years, so just take this as a grain of salt. Next up, I want to test out different third-party ear tips and see how they pair with the Plus, including the SpinFit CP100, 220, 230, as well as Comply and JVZ spiral dots, all in medium size. I've tried using Sony hybrids and final E-type, but unfortunately, they do not fit the earphone's nozzle, so I won't be able to make a comparison for those. Let's start with the SpinFit CP100. I find it to be able to concentrate sounds and somewhat improve upon the earphone's relatively weak clarity, similar to the foam tips I showed you before. In particular, it accentuates the treble slightly and cleans up the mids, both of which are much needed improvements for the Plus, though it does decrease the height of vertical soundstage, removing the one fantastic and rare property the earphone has going for it. But otherwise, I think this is a very good match. Next, we have the SpinFit CP220 and 230. Both of these are compatible with the earphone, but they both extend way too deeply into the ear canal. I can confidently say these two are easily the most uncomfortable tips I've ever used. They are also hard to get a good fit with. In terms of sound signature, both of these weaken the bass, but in particular for the CP220, I do think it makes the earphones sound more defined. Overall, I think the CP220 is a no-go. While CP230 does work better than the stock silicone tips in terms of sound signature, I don't think it's quite as good as the foam tips or the CP100. Another one I tried is the highly popular Comply ear tips. It is very bulky, but I think it's still okay in terms of comfort. But also because of its humongous size, I don't need to insert the earpiece too deep to get a good seal, which leads to a burst in horizontal soundstage. Sonically, it is similar to the single flange stock tips, except there is less mids and lower mids, and also the treble is not as well defined. But I would say these differences are quite minute. Overall, if you want wider soundstage, I guess the Comply can be considered. The final tip I tried is the JVZ spiral dots. This one is easy to comment on. It sounds just like the single flange tips, except again, there's less lower mids. The only major difference comes from comfort. The material is softer, so it is more comfortable. So to summarize, I think the best tips to use with the Massdrop Plus would be the SpinFit CP100. I think the stock foam tips are great too, but I'm leaning more towards the SpinFit because of durability issues with foam tips. The others are either too similar to the single flange tips, or they are just straight up not comfortable to use. The Massdrop Plus is a brave attempt by the company to create an IEM that has both the sound properties of professional audio monitors and a bass quality that is favorable to music lovers, all packaged into a product that is assembled and QC'd in the US with a relatively affordable price to boot. But unfortunately for me personally, all these hopes and dreams just vanish and break down one after another. Starting from sound signature, I didn't get any sense of extended bass, clarity, or full and fun sound. The sub-bass is too weak to actually sound extended. There's no punch, no dynamic, no rumbling to speak of with this. The mids are slightly muddy because of problematic tuning in the lower mids. Male vocals and cello aren't all that rich, not to mention when there's too much going on in the music, picking out individual elements is not easy, including vocals. Treble is not as bright and airy as I would have liked, so percussion instruments suffer. Now of course, these are all just issues related to sound signature, and they can mostly be fixed by using EQ, But the thing is, if you need to EQ an earphone for it to sound acceptable, it's probably not worth your money to begin with. Then again, our preference to sound signature is mostly subjective, and I can respect all the other people who actually like the earphone in this aspect. But I will argue that things like punchy bass, airiness, and good articulation are all marks of good IEM, regardless of subjective opinions or objective analysis, and this earphone is not delivering in any of these. The earphone is not completely rid of good qualities though. I like the earphone Soundstage for its width, which puts it only behind the EX1000, and I especially favor the taller than average Soundstage, which so many small form factor earphones fail at presenting. I will say one of my favorite earphones of all time, the AKG N5005, is inferior to the Plus in this aspect. Still, I think the Massdrop Plus is by no means a top-of-the-line killer in terms of sound signature and sheer technicalities. Besides the earphone, I'm just appalled by how bad some of the accessories are. The cable in particular is stiff and rubbery, it generates a lot of cable noise, the choker is practically unusable, and it shows poor craftsmanship with the sloppy molding of the ear guide. My balance cable also loses sound occasionally on the right side when paired with the Plus. Foam tips are breaking already after just being taken off the earphone twice because the tube inside is way too narrow. Earphone has this red spot that might have been useful during assembly, but to a general customer, this just looks like unremoved dirt. Even the packaging is super cheap, just a plain looking box with no foam compartments inside. Like I said before, there are cheaper earphones from China that provides better unboxing experience, but I will argue that this is less of an issue compared to the list of problems the Plus already has. I sincerely hope Massdrop will fix all these problems and come out with a truly impressive and high quality product. As it stands, I simply cannot recommend this earphone to anyone who's willing to drop $300 for a pair of earphones unless you don't mind EQing it yourself to take away the lower mids and boost the 10 kHz. Otherwise, I would suggest looking into finding a pair of hopefully new in the box EX1000. The Onkyo E900M is a fantastic option based on sound signature alone, especially for those who like crispy thin treble. The Moondrop Blessing from China is also looking like a fantastic purchase because it matches really well with Harman target curve, which I'm looking into buying in the future. And this will conclude my detailed review of the Massdrop Plus. Let me know what you think of this earphone, and if you find this review useful or enjoyable, please drop a like or even subscribe for more detailed reviews done by me. You can't imagine how much effort I put into making these reviews, from writing the scripts, fact-checking, auditioning, improving the scripts, and then repeating the cycle again and again, not to mention filming, and the fact that I earned absolutely zero from making these. This is all driven purely by my enthusiasm for IEMs, and your support alone will encourage me to do what I love despite the huge time investment and lack of monetary motivations. But as always, thanks for watching, and I will see you in another video.